Hello everyone, and welcome to our new newsroom, the Tortoise's new newsroom on Berners Street. Big thank you to Emma Harley, who got us all moved in here. We haven't done this since March 2020, by which I mean we haven't held a think-in in person. We've spent a year and a half on a screen, and when I say we, I think I mean we in the biggest sense. We've all spent a year and a half on a screen. So, as you'll see, we're trying to do this a little gingerly. The room is quite sparsely populated, and for a reason. We want to make sure everyone feels comfortable at being at a certain distance from each other. But we hope over the coming weeks, we're going to be able to get more and more people in here so that we can get back to what we really think that Tortoise is all about. An open newsroom where people can come in and say what they think, and that we will get a better understanding of what's happening in the world because we're informed by you. And what we really hope now is that we're going to be able to make the most of what's happened in the last year and a half and get to hear what people think in our newsroom and online as well. So if you are joining us from home, welcome too. What we're going to try to do is make sure that we hear from you as well. So please, as ever, weigh in the chat. Make sure that if you want to say something, put your hand up. I'm going to bring you in. You can't see it here, but we've got screens on the side of the room. So if you are speaking to us from home, everyone in this room is going to be able to hear you. And if you are speaking to us in this room, everyone on the screen is going to be able to hear you because we're going to have mics. Now, I think we can generally agree that the definition of a middle-aged man is someone who struggles to do two things at once. And we're going to test that to destruction in the next hour. So if it's a little squeaky, please bear with me. I'm definitely trying my best. I didn't say, by the way, my name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder here at Tortoise. There are a bunch of my colleagues who are here, some people who are new, who haven't actually been at Tortoise are thinking. The idea is that this is based on an old news conference, an editorial conference, where everyone weighs in with what they think. And so we have a loosely enforced rule in the thinking, which is no questions. We want to hear what you have to say. We want to hear what you think. We want to hear your own personal experience. And the week before last, we did a podcast that was born of that, a podcast called A Son of Afghanistan, where one person who joined us in the think-in told his story of having been tortured at the age of 12, having been an Afghan refugee, having come and settled in Wolverhampton. And that's really the idea of what a think-in is. It's a way for us to get a better understanding of what's happening in the news because people walk in and tell their stories and their ideas. So I hope I've made clear to you that while we have, and we're very lucky to have, Shabnam and Yalda and David Richards at home, we've also got all of you. So please don't be shy. I know this is a big and intimidating and frankly upsetting subject, but it shouldn't be one that stops us from having a meaningful and sometimes difficult conversation. We've made the discussion this evening as simple and direct as possible. Afghanistan, what now? And I'm going to come to you, if I might, first, Shabnam Naseemi. What are you looking for now? What do you think are the best tells of what's happening in Afghanistan?
I think, well, first of all, the last 2 weeks have been just incredibly difficult, not only because of my work when it comes to Afghan affairs, but also because of my family, who came here in 1999, about 20 years ago, and settled here as refugees. So this was not a day we ever thought we'd ever have to go back to. This was a chapter that we thought had been closed because they fled Taliban rule themselves. And I thought, you know, with the international support and with the huge number of NATO troops and allies that went into Afghanistan, so much time and effort and money that was spent, that this was just never going to happen. It was something no one expected. Not only, you know, I know that most people say that we just didn't think that Kabul and would collapse this year. And I think there was actually intelligence that came out today saying that they just weren't informed. But for us, and the fact that I've traveled to Afghanistan many times, and, you know, Yalda, he also, whose family fled Afghanistan as refugees and now works in BBC. And I think for us, as women who grew up in the West and who have refugee stories, we were just looking forward towards a brighter future. And I think, as hopefully our stories would show, that if you given the opportunity and the time and the money and the effort, that like us, Afghans in Afghanistan would have flourished. And they wanted to live in a democratic, liberal society under freedom. And one thing that infuriates me is that the West and the US and Britain weren't forced out of Afghanistan. People didn't kick you out. People didn't tell you, we don't want you. We don't want your way of life and what you've brought to Afghanistan. No one did that. And they embraced it so warmly, because every time I went to Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and I first went back in 2004, and every trip was more different than the previous one, because I saw young girls outside in coffee shops sitting down and socializing with men. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I was terrified to go back. I used to sort of wear my scarf so tightly because I actually thought that the Taliban will come and get me. I was really young. I was terrified. And I thought, how is it possible that these young girls and boys are sitting in coffee shops just the way we do in London? And every year it became better and better. And for my father, the biggest change he saw, because before 2001, he couldn't travel back to his province in Parwan, which is the north of Afghanistan, because of Taliban control, and they were patrolling the streets. So when we returned, the first thing he was so grateful for was that he could travel freely to his home and to his birthplace and where he's from. So it wasn't perfect. It really wasn't. And why would you expect that Afghanistan would become a self-sufficient, independent country after 20 years? Because the West wasn't made like that either in 20 years. No country in the world can you expect that after 20 years will become a country that can stand on its own 2 feet. It's a military that will fight on its own. And how you raised the bar so high for Afghanistan. When you went there, you started with a blank canvas. There was no infrastructure, no institutions, and it was a war-torn country. So for me, this was a huge catastrophe, and emotionally and in many ways. But what I'd like to, we've talked about what went wrong and why we did it, and we've had so many of these conversations, but for me, from my work politically, over the last few years, I've persisted and pushed MPs and officials and people who work there to talk about Afghanistan. And no matter how many times I tried, they just weren't interested, because it wasn't that important in their view, or it hadn't sort of become a crisis yet. So I'd ask for MPs to raise a question in the House of Commons, to form a debate, or to attend events, and they're always too busy. Whereas now, everyone's suddenly talking about their experiences in Afghanistan and how this was a mistake. Well, where were you when we needed you to talk about it? We needed you to sell the case that this was a worthy intervention. This was an intervention not only for Afghanistan, but for the region and for our own safety. So,
but Shabnam, I just want to ask you, because I want to ask about what now, and I'm sorry, this is a really naive question.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll be able to go back?
No, I don't think so. I've been quite vocal about my stance against the Taliban. I've actually had, probably like most people who speak out, a lot of Taliban threaten on social media that you won't be able to set foot back here.
And do you have family there?
I do. I have my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, so my extended family is still there. And
so what does that mean in terms of what you're really worried about now?
What I'm really worried about is, when I talk to them, what they tell me is they can't leave the house. So
you can talk to them. You can give them a call. You can text message.
I can call them. Yes, there is still internet connection. Although in Panjshir, where the resistance is happening, apparently the internet connection there has been cut off. Of course, because of fighting. But in Kabul, it's still fine. But what I hear from them, they're wanting us to help, and I really don't know what I can do. And we're trying to find ways for them to leave to neighboring countries, but it's still quite difficult. But what we're hearing from them is just that there's no jobs, and we've seen some footage of queues outside banks. So money is becoming quite stark, and there aren't any job opportunities anymore. Basically, there's no government. So it's in a state of collapse. And for women and the female members of my family, they're not going to school at the moment. And I think either some are saying that schools are open, but others are saying that there aren't. And my own personal family members are saying they're just not going to school out of fear.
Let me ask you, Yalda, can I ask you, and David Richard, I'm going to come to you in a second, just so that you can see us. I hope you can see us there. You're smiling. Okay, yes. Yalda, is there any version of, well, I don't start with you, just personally, what do you think it means?
Look, James, I think what's jolted so many of us as far as Afghanistan is concerned is that there are two words that I've continually heard over the last few weeks. It's betrayal and abandonment. You know, this is the last 2 decades, and the people that I've been speaking to, the young men and women, they are the quintessential 9/11 generation. These are people who didn't live under the Taliban. They don't understand Taliban rule. They don't understand the oppression that the Taliban inflicted on their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents, their relatives. These are people who experienced, sure, there was a war and it was imperfect, but they experienced freedom and opportunity, and they took those freedoms with both hands. And they've said to me, we were asked to stick our necks out on a whim, on a promise from America and Britain and the West. You know, they inspired us, they funded us, they sheltered us, they financed us, and then they abandoned us. The democratic process that we were supposed to be part of abandoned us in the end. And I suppose, so what's personally jolted me, and I'm in a difficult position because I'm a journalist, but also this is very personal. It's the country of my birth. I left there when I was 6 months old, but that's where I started my career. I went back there as a journalist for the first time in my early 20s. And I was just there 6 weeks ago before the fall of Kabul. What's jolted me is the values that I believed in, and the values of, you take a nation and you make it dependent on yourself. So therefore, it becomes difficult to buy this argument that bad things happen in a lot of places, and therefore we can't save everyone. But America's own history speaks to that. You're able to be the leaders of the free world post-Second World War and deal with your own internal issues of civil rights bills and things like that. So when you make a nation dependent on you, you invade, then you have a sense of responsibility towards that.
And is there any version of the next 6 months, 5 years, that you think is better than pre-9/11 Taliban? Is there a Taliban 2.0 that you think genuinely might be more constructive, better in terms of women and women's rights, or is that just incredibly naive?
I don't think it's incredibly naive. I've spent time with the Taliban in both Doha. I spent time with their leadership. I traveled to Kabul and met foot soldiers and commanders. The problem is, and what I think we need to understand is, when we say Taliban, it's not one homogenous entity, one group, right? So right now, you've got provinces that are run by certain commanders who strike deals with tribal elders. And therefore, they decide girls can go to school, segregated, but they can go to school. There might be other places where it's much more hardline or hardcore. Maybe the Haqqani network runs it, or some other element. And therefore, they bring in their own rules. So they, within themselves, frankly, didn't expect Kabul to fall. I spoke to the Taliban spokesperson the morning that Kabul fell on air.
Yeah,
he phoned me. And I had a conversation. But before that, we were texting, because I had so many frightened young women who, I was in contact with all night, saying, the Taliban are at the gates of Kabul. The Taliban are here. We can see them. We can hear them. And I was contacting Afghan leaders saying, from within the government, what's going on? And first there was silence. And then there was this kind of weird attempt to reassure. There's nothing going on. The Taliban are not here. Nobody should panic. And I remember it was 4:30 in the morning, and I was texting these women, and I thought, if I sleep, and what if I wake up and Kabul has fallen? And 2 hours later, I woke up to a message from my editor saying, Kabul's fallen, get into the studio now. It's a Sunday, I don't work on a Sunday. On my way in, I was texting the spokesperson saying, look, I've got all these frightened people. What are you guys doing? This is not what you told me you would do when we met in Doha. he promised me an inclusive Afghanistan. He said to me, we made mistakes in the 90s. We don't want to see a return to the 90s. You know, we realized.
Do you buy that, Yalda? Do you buy it?
To be honest with you, I was charmed by it. You know, and I have to be completely honest here. Sure, as a journalist, I was skeptical. I'm aware of what they're capable of. But I was in that space. I thought, you know what? If what you're telling me is the truth, then actually we are dealing with a corrupt, weak government, that there is insecurity in the country.
But 2 weeks on, are you more skeptical?
Yes, because I'm seeing that they don't even know how to govern. It's one thing being an insurgency, it's another thing being a government. And when a blast happens and ISIS, you know, blows themselves up in an airport, the previous government, you know, however weak they were, the special forces and a special forces unit would get into the crime scene and know exactly what to do. They were trained by the Americans, they were trained by the British, they were trained by NATO. They knew how to be effective and save as many lives as possible. The Taliban, after the airport incident, it took them an hour and a half to get there. They were sort of scrambling because they'd broken down all the institutions. So the ambulance turned up off their own back, you know, because they were like, okay, what are the Taliban going to do? An hour in, nothing, okay, we're going to go in.
But Yalda, that's incompetence.
Yes.
That's different from whether or not they're going to bring back a regime of cruelty.
Yes, yes.
Do you think,
well,
we just don't know yet?
Look, we haven't seen the kind of atrocities that people thought that we would. But then up until yesterday, the eyes of the world, the cameras of the world were on Kabul.
Well, you know what I'd like to ask David the same question, because I'd like to get into thinking about refugees, thinking about recognition economics, thinking about what it means for the West. But David, before we do that, can I ask you the same question that I really asked Shabnam and Yalda, which is personally how you feel? I really have thought a lot about this conversation with you, because I think we met just as you'd returned from running ISAF, and you run the armed forces, and I think all of us, to take on Yalda's point, have this sense of, I suppose, a certain degree of guilt and certainly bewilderment. And I just want to know how you feel about the time that you've spent there and what's happened now.
Well, of course, I can't speak with the personal authority of Shabnam and Yalda, none of which either what they said I would disagree with, by the way, particularly on the need to think of this as a generational struggle, and the West's lack of strategic patience has bedeviled us, you know, for a long time. Very quickly, I remember in 2009 being asked by the BBC how long I thought we'd be engaged in Afghanistan. And I'm a very minor historian, but I said another 30 to 35 years, emphasizing that it wouldn't be in the combat role, but we need to be there for that sort of length of time, rather like we were already doing in Northern Ireland, but there are many other examples. And I was pilloried by politicians and a lot of media, actually. I'm sure not you, James.
I think we're actually, to be perfectly honest, David, I think we splashed on it on the front page of the Times at the time.
I think you did, actually.
I'm glad we're having this chance to clear that up. But can I just say, though, David, do you think that actually, if you'd had the choice, if you were still in a position to advise the government, that would have been your advice to say, look, if we are in, we're in for a generation or more. We need to be in for 30 years.
Without doubt. I remember I fought hard against David Cameron's decision, which he took with other leaders when I was CDS, to come out of the combat role, because I thought it was premature. But after I left, they went ahead and accelerated it, actually. But that was done absolutely on the understanding that we would remain there in a guiding and training and humanitarian and governmental, all the other things that we've been doing for as long as is necessary. Of course, Biden took the rug from under us, even if I don't know if Boris Johnson intended to sustain it or not, but we couldn't do it without the Americans. That says a lot about our armed forces.
Well, David, I'd like to talk about that. I definitely think we want to talk about that, the US-UK relationship and the implications. But can I just press it one more time about how you feel about it? Because we've heard a lot on the radio and on TV and in the pages of the papers, this sense of particularly British serving personnel who said, look, we went there to try and do a job, and now we've, to use Yalda's phrase, abandoned people. How do you square what you did, what you told to people serving in the British Armed Forces, what you told to your Afghan colleagues, and the decision that's taken? How does that leave you thinking about the role that you played?
Well, I think they'll forgive me because they knew my heart was in the right place, but I felt great sorrow, shame, and now anger, because we have dumped on the Afghan people who we made huge promises and commitments to, and because it doesn't suit us, we've cut and run. And not only just cut and run, we've done it in the most, pathetic way militarily, very good execution at the airport. But this, I mean, I think we probably talked about speed of events before now. The West's decision cycle, as we talk about in the military, has been outwitted and outpaced by the Taliban, which is why we ended up at Kabul airport in the way we did, absolutely in hock to the Taliban. I would just like to emphasize, I also share Yalda's confidence to a degree that we have no option now, and I know you want to look at the future, but to work with and engage with the Taliban. There is no alternative, because no Western country is going to mount some sort of counterattack out of the Panjshir Valley, whether we might like to emotionally or not. So they are going to run the country. I believe we need to engage with them quickly and start leading them rather than waiting to see how they respond. One, the Russians and Chinese will fill that vacuum, but also they need to see that there are lots of carrots to be had if only they can get a grip of those other elements that Yalda spoke so well about.
Well, there are a host of people I'd like to hear from who are on screen, and there are a number of people in the room. I'm going to come in a moment to Alistair Campbell, because I don't know whether you saw, he'd written a really interesting piece about the way in which the UK-US relationship used to work. And so I'm going to come to Alistair in a moment. Karen Smith had also made a point about the UK-US relationship. And I want to come to Ro, who I mentioned at the beginning, had joined us at a Think-In, and hear from him, just picking up on your point, Shabnam. Before I do that, I'm just going to ask practically two very simple questions, and for Shabnam and Yalda. One is refugees, and the other is recognition. What do we need to do about the people who are still there? And do we or don't we work with the Taliban government?
Well, firstly, in terms of refugees, the UK government has announced 20,000 to be relocated, not this year, but next few years, which I think firstly is a mistake. We seem to misunderstand what the situation is. And I think one of the reasons why we've in some ways failed in our understanding of what Afghanistan is and what the cultural, the religious, the historical climate is like, is that we don't understand that if you're going to announce 20,000 people to be relocated, this is not, they're not facing poverty or hunger or something that can be dealt with in the meantime until they come here. They're facing imminent risk of life and death. And I think one of the questions that I'd like to ask is, about 15,000 people have been relocated so far. I want to know, first of all, who these people are. I mean, it's great to hear that so many have, but every day I'm hearing from people, first of all, 69 members of parliament who are still messaging in hiding, house to house, because they don't feel safe being in the same place.
Sorry, 69 members of the Afghan
female MPs, yes.
Left in Kabul.
Yes, the majority of them are. So I want to know why those people haven't been evacuated, because I know that in the last 20 years, our work has been in promoting women's rights. And
Shabnam, can I just ask you a question? Do you think, so we had Dominic Raab today, give an account, and I worry a little bit that we've kind of drifted into this, how many Brits are left? Oh, it's in the low hundreds. Do you think that the number of people who are left behind who are in danger, regardless of their nationality, is running to the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands? What do you think we're talking about?
Look, it's really difficult, because when I get requests for help, we can't get 38 million people out. You can't get a whole country out. And everyone's going to say that they don't want to live under the Taliban rule. You just can't get them out. It's just not practical. But what we do have a responsibility, not only a moral responsibility, to get the people who we've, like Yalda said, given the hope and the direction and the funding and the training and the capacity to support our mission indirectly. Now, the remit of the resettlement scheme, even still, is too narrow, because first of all, the ARAP, which is to resettle and relocate people who directly work with the British and the British government. Then we've got the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme. Again, too narrow, because there are artists, comedians, musicians who are also part of this freedom of speech democratic society who are not part of that list. There are many people who indirectly supported British mission in Afghanistan, and I don't think that's been noticed so far. This is going to take time, and we've got to have a much more coordinated plan, because the evacuation was a catastrophe, in my opinion. I mean, Biden literally said yesterday that it was an extraordinary success, and I just thought, what world are you living in? And next phase, we've just got to plan it a lot better, because we can't lose more lives like this, and it needs to happen now.
So I just want to do the other half, Yael, if I might, with you, just because I think there is what's the scale of refugee crisis that we've still got to resolve? What's the kind of warm welcome that the UK genuinely offers, and still to whom? I know there are still people involved. I know you've got a foundation, Yael, that's been getting people out. I wonder whether you could just talk about this recognition question. Ruth Davidson wrote a piece for us today where her argument was the risk is we get into actually quite a strangely comforting argument amongst ourselves about recrimination, and we miss the challenge in front of us, which is humanitarian. And I wonder, if you want to do the best in humanitarian terms by Afghan people, do you have to recognize the Taliban? You have to work with that government.
I'm just going to read something to you. This is a statement given by Al-Qaeda's General Command today, and they've issued their first statement on recent events in Afghanistan, congratulating the Taliban on their historic victory and praying for their success in imposing Islamic Sharia in the country. Now, Amin al-Haq, the head of security and Osama bin Laden's top bodyguard, appeared in Nangarhar in eastern Afghanistan yesterday. So in terms of the direction in which the Taliban could go at this point in time, and especially the hardline elements, we've got that here. And it's not just that. 6 months ago, the United Nations issued a report talking about the historic ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and the fact that Al-Qaeda still very much feels protected by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The US Treasury, so, when the administration says that we don't have any evidence of their links and ties, US Treasury, which is part of US government, put out a statement and a report about 3 months ago talking about their links and ties. Now, that's a separate question to legitimacy. I think that the UK and the US and the international community needs to work really hard to ensure that they hold the Taliban accountable. But to David's point, they are now the new guys in town. And the best way, in my view, is to make sure that the more moderates are worked on, because there are hardline elements.
But just listening to that, I mean, it sort of answers the question. You can't recognize a government that is being celebrated by Al-Qaeda. You can't. I presume you can't.
I mean, and when you put that to the Taliban, which I have, they've said our agreement with the United States is that we don't allow Afghanistan to become a sanctuary for terrorism. Now, I've had a lot of analysts and friends who have said to me, in 1996, you had to be pretty imaginative to think that Afghanistan would become a terrorist haven, and in 2001, you'd have a 9/11. In 2021, you have to have amnesia.
Yeah. Point. Well, listen, on that, I'm going to come back to David in a moment on that question about what now, but I wondered if I could just to bring in Alistair, because I hope many people here will have read it, Alistair, but part of the point you were making was the one that sort of David touched upon, which was what coordination had there been, or in fact, the absence of any coordination in terms of the way in which the withdrawal was conducted. Do you want to tell us just what you think of that now, and what that suggests to you about the future of the UK-US relationship and any future military activity or humanitarian activity?
Well, I mean, I think it was obvious from Boris Johnson's the debate on Afghanistan in Parliament that there was no real genuine consultation. And also, I think it was pretty obvious from Dominic Raab's performance at the Select Committee today, the British government, once Trump had done his deal, there was just a kind of, well, it's going to happen and it's not really our thing. And as long, there just seemed to be sort of a completely cavalier attitude to what was going on. And in front of you, the piece that I wrote for you, when Matthew first phoned me and said, would I do it? Matthew would say this. I actually said no. I said, because I'm just so depressed about it. I'm so fed up about it. I'm really disappointed with Biden and what he's done. I've got what Johnson does doesn't surprise me at all, because I think he's a truly awful human being. And I think there are foreign policy and statecraft failures that can be laid right directly at his door. But Biden really did surprise me. And I said in the piece, I mean, people remember the story of Thatcher and Reagan and Grenada, and that was maybe a bit of a blip. But I can't think of a single really major policy that would have an effect upon us, our interests, our military, our strategic interests, our security interests, where there wouldn't have been kind of interaction between the US and the UK at literally every single level of government. And most importantly, President and Prime Minister.
But Alex, can I just ask you one thing? As people will be hearing you, and I don't know whether when you read Tony Blair's piece 10 days ago, obviously it made you also think, well, how does this fit with the discussion and debates about Iraq as well? And Kerry Thomas and I were talking the week before last about long-term commissions for tortoise. We thought, actually, you know what? Next year, it'll be 40 years since the Falklands. I suddenly stopped and thought, actually, that was the UK's last, quote unquote, successful overseas military adventure or venture. I don't know what the word is.
Kosovo, Sierra Leone. I think
Kosovo, Sierra Leone. Fair enough. But it was not, in that same sense, kind of quite so clearly a kind of with a UK flag on it. And I just wonder whether or not you've then, as a result of all of this, reconsidered what the military is for, what British foreign policy is for.
Well, I think I have reconsidered it, but not necessarily because of that, but because of what has happened and I go over this in the piece, I think that we're endangering our hard power by the cuts that we've seen to the armed forces. I think we're in danger. I think we're actually doing that as well with our cuts to overseas aid. I think Brexit has made us blow up the bridge with the European Union. At the same time, we now appear to have damaged the bridge with the United States. So the two strongest foreign policy assets that we have, we've damaged them, undermined them. And so, yes, I look back and when I was listening to David speak there, and I can remember in the build-up, post 9/11, in the build-up to the intervention in Afghanistan, I can remember being up in Scotland, and Tony was speaking at a conference, and we had a meeting with some Afghanis from up there, from Afghans from Scotland. And they were basically saying, look, if you're going to do this, you better make sure that you commit to this for the long term. And I can remember Tony saying, listen, we are going to be there for the long term for as long as this takes. And he meant that. But I think that I say in the piece, I think that Trump has been such a terrible thing for the world in so many ways. But one of the things that we've done, you allied that to the way the media landscape's changed, the way we've changed in our habits, and we've lost any sense of what long-term really means. 20 years is a long time, but it's not that long a time in historical terms. And we've lost that sense. David's absolutely right about that. If you were to say to anybody now, oh, well, it'll take 35 years. Nobody said that in the Cold War, or you take the fact that after the Second World War, my brother was in the military. He was in Germany in the 1990s. That was Germany. That wasn't Afghanistan. So we just lost that sense of a commitment to the long term. And I'll tell you, when we talk about Iraq and learning the lessons of Iraq, I think Syria showed us that one of the lessons we've learned is that unless you've got leaders of real conviction and real guts, we're never going to do the really difficult things.
Well, you know what I'd like to do, Alistair, if I might, I'd like to ask Ro, who told his story to my colleague Basher Cummings, who is here somewhere, I think. Oh no, sorry, I can see her on the screen. Forgive me, I am trying to be in two places at once. Who told the story of his escape from torture at the hands of the Taliban. Ro's there, he's up on the screen. Here, Ro, there's a risk, as I said, that we get into this conversation about British foreign policy, what now for America in the world. But just keeping focused on this question of Afghanistan, what now? What are you worried about now, and what would you like the world to do next?
I think for me, we have to, dig a bit deeper in the power structures within the Taliban, as Yalda alluded to earlier. So the Taliban are not just a homogeneous whole. They've got various interests, and now that they're sharing power, those interests going to, diverge. Everybody wants a bigger piece of the pie, the power pie. And we have to look at the way the Taliban have been behaving in the last couple of weeks. Kabul is pretty much held by the Haqqanis. And then to dig even deeper, you have to understand the history of the communities that they belong to, the East and the Western, the Southern Pashtuns against each other. They've been at loggerheads against each other for, at least 3 centuries, fighting for power at the same time as fighting to subjugate other communities. But for me, the immediate concern is that, how much are we ready as the allure and the largesse that power brings to the Taliban and the various interests that's going to push them in and pull them into different directions.
And what do you,
there will be inevitability of, the Taliban imploding. Are we ready for that? And also, the specter of civil war is very heavy at the moment. So the Taliban are trying to rule Afghanistan, the 60% of whom they've got nothing in common. Now, Afghanistan is not a done deal. The Taliban is, we have a naivety in the West thinking this is over. It is not. We're just having Afghanistan going into a different phase in its conflict. And we've just lost.
Well, Ro, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I'd like to know what you think about the question of whether or not Western funding should go to communities, even if the government in those communities is the Taliban. But I want to make sure, I'm hearing from people in the room, so just catch my eye. And I want to make sure, just to pick up on something that you said, Ro, and put it to David Richards. David, if you hear Ro's account of things, then this is a nation that is still at war. It's a different war, and there's going to be a question about what kind of military engagement the UK and its allies chooses in these circumstances, in this civil war. And I wonder what you think that should be.
Well, there's one thing what I think it should be, and another what I think it will be. I do not think there's any appetite in the West, as has been proved by the incompetent leadership that Alistair so graphically reminded us we're now suffering under. There's a complete absence of statesmen and statecraft, I'm afraid, in the current generation. But I think what they'll do is do lots of drone strikes and take out terrorists when they see them in the ungoverned space that is opening up. What I think they should do, and this is a subtlety that I suspect I haven't got across, they need to engage now, not necessarily recognize, but engage with the moderate Taliban leadership that Yalda described so well, in order to give them a chance to dominate the others. And if they can start to see that good will come out of that, in the interest of the Afghan people who have been through hell and back for the last 40 years, then there's a chance that we might yet seize the initiative in military speak, albeit there's going to be some very delicate periods on and off over the next few months. But if you don't do that, I'm afraid the hardliners will, as Ro just so well brought out, will start to dominate, and there's a real risk of civil war. I think we need to help the moderates, and I do this with my eyes open, start to lead and govern, and that needs engagement. And the first thing I do is a proper UN coordinated international humanitarian intervention operation. And I think the Afghan, the moderate Taliban would actually let us do that, because they can't otherwise do it. And so there's a way of getting in, starting to influence them, and then you take them from there. But it is a big difference between what I'm proposing and what you heard Raab say today about waiting and seeing, sticks at the ready, and if they behave, then we might do something. Big difference.
Do you think they would? I mean, what David's saying, do you think it's feasible that if you put in a UN humanitarian operation into Afghanistan, that the Taliban would host it in effect?
You know, the one thing that I realized in my interaction with the Taliban is they want legitimacy. Only 3 governments recognized them the last time. And interestingly, there's 4 embassies that remain in Afghanistan that haven't left: the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis. Now that gives you a sense of where the Taliban are heading. They were virtually given a state visit about a month and a half ago, before the fall of Kabul. They went to China and they were given a state visit virtually as the kind of government in waiting, or a shadow government. So I do think that the international community needs to reach out, as David said, and see if there can be some kind of humanitarian mission, because it could take a different shape for us if they go down the China-Russia path.
Yeah. David, can I just put to you one other thing? Zoe Jones, I know everyone can see this, so I'm going to read it out for those people in the room. Zoe Jones put this point that says, the Taliban's motivation has never waned, whereas the US and the UK have tired of it. I agree with Alistair Campbell about our lack of perspective and the fact that we fundamentally have nothing that we want there, which is what's led to this withdrawal. This has been completely self-interested and a practical act, but not the right one morally. And she says, are we scuppered by our lack of hard power and our reliance on alliance? And I wanted to put that to you, David, and I think we've heard Tony Blair talk about this before, this question, which is, we can look back over the last 20 years and quite easily come to the conclusion that nothing works militarily. You put boots on the ground in Iraq, it doesn't work. You try and operate some kind of arm's length operation in Syria, it doesn't work. You do just Air Force in Libya, it doesn't seem to work. You can't help concluding that our hard power doesn't work.
Well, as Alistair correctly reminded us, Kosovo, Bosnia and Sierra Leone, which by the way was an exclusively British operation, was very successful. But yeah, the strategy that's been adopted since then in all those conflicts that you mentioned have not been right, and nor have things like the correlation of forces, the number of troops engaged. But there's another, if I may quickly, there's another, I heard Rob talk about how it had drifted into nation building. You had to have nation building as part of the military. Indeed, I would call it an enabler, because otherwise the people of Afghanistan would just have seen nothing but fighting, and very quickly they'd have got fed up with us because there was nation building.
Haven't we totally rewritten the script on this? I remember that nation building was absolutely essential to part of the project. The whole idea was that it wasn't just about protecting, it was about, ensuring better lives, particularly for women and girls in Afghanistan, but for a different kind of subject. Didn't we always say that?
Yeah, but I don't think there was ever any clarity. Afghanistan was mission accomplished within 3 months of the war, and then these gimmicky sort of slogans came up: hearts and minds, nation building, blood and treasure. We heard it all over 20 years. But I mean, maybe I don't know, David. You're privy to these conversations more. Was there ever a strategy? Was there ever a plan, or did Iraq happen and Afghanistan was no longer sexy, and so they kind of it was the war that bubbled on in the background, and it wasn't kind of a priority?
Well, Alistair was at the centre of this, but from my perspective, yes, Iraq did undoubtedly deflect the Americans at a critical time. But again, it's very good to see Alistair again, by the way. Under Tony Blair, I felt we had a leader who at least understood grand strategy. We don't have that anymore. Under him, NATO agreed to take over from the Americans in 2004, and in 2006, the result was, for what it's worth, I went in at the head of this new ISAF, and we weren't resourced sufficiently well, but we were feeling our way a bit. Subsequently, that was corrected. But I think it's wrong to say that military intervention will never work. The correct military intervention, along with other activity, of which you can include nation building, describe it as you will, probably will work. And Kosovo is an example, and Sierra Leone is an example. We didn't do that in Syria. Forget it. I did put forward a plan, fun enough, as my last act virtually as CDS, which would have seen a much more comprehensive approach, and I think we would have probably succeeded then. We didn't didn't do it in Libya, and it's been a disaster. So, I think it can be made. Don't get, well, I suppose I should say, and I would say this, wouldn't I? Don't get disillusioned about it. It can work when it's done properly, led by statesmen, executed by soldiers and diplomats who really understand their craft. We don't have that in Whitehall or clearly, sadly, at the moment across the pond.
By the way, please don't be coy. If you want to weigh in, you don't have to be at home to be able to be on screen. We've figured out a way that you can speak to them. So just put your hand up and we'll make sure that we get a mic to you. Shabnam, can I ask you just on the question now about Afghanistan and helping Afghanistan, what do you think about the way in which the UK then accepts or welcomes in 15,000 people? Because I think there's also a question for all of us here, which is, what can I actually do? If you feel what Alistair feels, just frustrated and angry, is there anything you actually think you can do that can make a difference to Afghans who kind of move into the UK?
Yes. Just before I go on to that, two things I wanted to say. David mentioned, and you asked the question of nation building. Militarily, yes, you may not succeed, but nation building comes with the package. So to say that, or with Biden saying that we were never there to build the country, you can't go into a country and say we're going to destroy terrorists and not create a society, because it will always be a breeding ground for terrorism. So I don't agree with that. It works hand in hand, and it's just delusional if you think that you can go into a country and destroy terrorism by not and not work on the country itself. The second thing around moderate Taliban, I don't actually believe there is any. The concept doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as a moderate Taliban. It's all slick PR, it's diplomacy, and like Helder mentioned, they want legitimacy. To think that the ones that we see on the screen are any different to the ones on the ground is also, it's wrong and it's absolute rubbish. There's no such thing as moderate Taliban. And also, they're a very, very disorganized, uncoordinated group, like Roe and Yalda mentioned.
Hold on. So you don't think there is what David described? You don't think there is a kind of moderate Taliban?
No, I don't. I don't believe that at all. I think.
So you don't think this idea of a UN force would work, or a UN humanitarian operation would work?
I think they may agree to it, again, just for recognition, but on the ground, you will not see them actually comply with what we're telling them to do. And again, all eyes have been in Kabul. Already things have happened across the other provinces, and we just haven't heard. And in terms of free media, the importance now is to protect that so that we hear what's happening in other provinces, which we haven't. So yes, I don't believe in that regard. The point around resettlement, just quickly, I think, first of all, I know we've got a Conservative government, and whilst I don't agree with a lot of Priti Patel's policies, we are going to be inviting 20,000 new refugees, if not more. The key now is to make sure that they are integrated into society. Now, we don't know who, like I said, my concern is we don't know who we've invited to the UK and throughout their evacuation, and there are going to be a lot of people, first of all, going through trauma. I mean, decades of conflict, but also people who might actually hold extremist views. So it's also about how do you work with them and those narratives to integrate them into society, help them learn English, get into employment, get into education. And when we talk about welcoming Britain, it's not about just bringing them here and then just leaving them. And then a couple of years down the line, complaining that we have refugees who are on welfare, on benefits, they don't really contribute. Well, if you're not going to invest the time and energy to focus on these people who you've invited, what was the point of bringing them here in the first place? And second of all, I think I've lost my point.
Well, I'm going to come back to it, because I do think that,
yes.
I do think that's one of the things that's striking about this is, for all the discussion, we haven't really heard much about how that program's going to work, and I really worry about that point. I just want to bring my colleague Matt D'Ancona in. Matt, we seem to have got you in a Perspex cubicle, Matt. But I tell you, I just wanted to ask you what you thought of the point that Yalda made right at the beginning about that kind of jolt to the way in which you think about the world, this country, and the relationship between the two.
Well, it's huge, and I'm very conscious of the fact that we're 10 days away from the 20th anniversary of 9/11. and it's obviously a melancholy anniversary anyway, but it's particularly melancholy because the hope one had out of that atrocity was that there would come an understanding of what binds there to here, and that those two words would mean less. And I think there was at least an implicit understanding that there was no point in intervening in a country to bring down the regime that had hosted and given sanctuary to Al-Qaeda if one didn't then follow up with a significant strategy. The problem was that there were, as we know now fully, huge differences of doctrine within the American government at the time, between the Pentagon, who effectively believed that Jeffersonian democracy would spring from wherever the Americans went, and the more nuanced view of people like Colin Powell, who understood that you have to actually, introduce measures and stay in places, not as a garrison, not as an occupying force, but as the hard power that backs up all the soft power. That got completely lost during Iraq and afterwards. And I think it's now that whole mission, that whole idea that there is which we've heard spoken about this evening, that you can go into countries with ethical purpose, stay there and assist people, in this incredibly difficult transition from one situation being governed by theocratic, totalitarian, misogynist fascists to something better.
But I guess that's my question, Matt, is do you think, because I look around, Kerry, Carol, I'll come to you in a second. So I'm 51. My working life has essentially been a kind of arc of 90s optimism, and then the last 20 years.
Indeed.
And I wonder whether or not we've come to a point here where the next time it comes around that someone says, we in the UK must be part of an effort to rid the world of this evil and put a stop to this, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, we're now going to be a generation of people who say, we don't have the staying power. We don't have the power to do that. Whether something fundamentally has changed as a result of what we've seen in August.
I mean, what is deeply depressing is that politics has been fundamentally reconfigured. So we live in an introspective age. We live in an age of instant gratification and radical impatience, where things are measured by tweets, not by decades. The prospects for a better way are not conspicuous, but as I think David said earlier, one cannot yield to that despair. There is now a moral imperative as well as a strategic imperative to do whatever we can to retrieve from this, what I regard as a disaster, whatever we can to help the people of Afghanistan, whether that involves the UN or NGOs or money or welcoming refugees, all of the above. Yeah. This is a massive historic test.
Yeah. Matt, thank you. Kerry. So this is my colleague, Kerry Thomas, also a fellow editor here at Daughters.
I was just listening to Matt and others. I think at the same time that what's happened has been a jolt, but also that it shouldn't have been. Because I think what happened in Kabul, what happened in Afghanistan, wasn't just a product of talks that Donald Trump held in Doha. Everything actually has been pointing this direction in the US and the UK for a long time. So I think we shouldn't have been surprised as we were. If you go back to the way that Libya was dealt with, if you go back to the decisions that Obama took over Syria, if you go back to the way that Trump behaved, the way that the dial has shifted in this country over the appetite for foreign engagements, under Ed Miliband and since. All the needles have been pointing in this direction, and I don't think, where I disagree, I think with Alistair and with David Richards, I'm not sure that Sierra Leone and Kosovo are in the same category as the things that we're talking about.
Just because of the scale of the operation.
Scale, but also they didn't require the length of commitment that we're saying would have been required to make a success of Afghanistan. We were never going to be in Sierra Leone for 35 years.
But we've been in Korea for 70.
We have, but I appreciate that. But those the examples that were cited of kind of counterfactuals to the current crisis were just not sure they meet the sort of test that we're setting ourselves
No, you're
just
right.
failed in
I think Afghanistan requires much more effort and time. And that's why I think we fail to understand that 20 years is not enough for a blank canvas for something where you're starting from scratch. So,
Actually, can I just ask
Yeah.
you, because there was an interesting piece, my team in the Sense Maker did a piece on that Pew research and Biden's speech last night. And Biden's speech last night, you know, very conspicuously kept referring to the forever wars, because that Pew polling showed quite how popular the withdrawal in the United States is. And I wonder whether we're sort of out of touch, that we're a bit self-selecting, almost by dint of the people who've come to this thinking are people who care and think we've done the wrong thing. Whether or not actually in the UK, whether you've seen any polling, any political polling that says actually there's quite a high level of support for leaving Afghanistan, and there wouldn't have been much support for staying for David Richards' 30 years.
It's great that you mentioned this, because one thing that's quite common is once you're involved, I mean, I come from Afghanistan, so most of my networks are all people that talk about Afghanistan. And the minute I step out of that and I mention Afghanistan, a lot of people are like, well, I didn't know that's happening. Oh, really? Why did that happen? Or completely no idea of the context of the situation. And I think one of the failures is that when I see polls on this withdrawal recently, everyone states, well, it's a good thing we've left. We can't stay there forever. It has nothing to do with us. It's a war far, far away. We spent all our money there, all our time, and 450 people, British troops died. Again, an enormous contribution. But the fact that you don't know that far away war was not just a conflict that you were fighting for another country. It was Afghanistan's geographical position is so important, and it's why we went to Afghanistan in the first place. It's the heart of Asia. It impacts the region, and the stability of that country has always impacted us in the West. Strategically, security-wise, you know, in terms of soft power, in every sense of the word. Our intervention in Afghanistan is completely separate to Syria or Sierra Leone or any other country that we bring into discussion. It's a whole unique case.
So I want to, by the way, we're back in the newsroom and I'm getting back to old habits, really struggling with timekeeping. So apologies for that. I want to do three things if I can before we end. One is, Nigel Quinton has asked a really good question, which is, can someone talk about Pakistan and the extent to which Pakistan is key in this? And so, David Richards, I'm going to come to you on that. Ro has his hand up. I want to make sure we just hear a final thought from you. And you, sir, have the mic?
I have the mic, but...
Sorry, introduce yourself.
My name's Adam Bethlehem. I'm an uninformed person who's going to struggle not to ask a question, so I'm going to frame what I say as... Can you hear me? Sorry.
Far away.
I'm going to frame it as an observation. And so I'm really naive to this debate, and I'm a doctor. I work in a vaccine clinic, and I've met a whole bunch of people in London who are, you know, refugees all the way. You know, you meet everybody in London. Okay. And so my observation is that as we talk about nation building in Afghanistan, what I think about in terms of the US is that Joe Biden is having to cope with nation building in the United States.
Yes.
And I just and something that's important that I'm sure that other people who are better informed will understand is what will happen in the midterms if the far right in America take control of parts of the legislature.
Yeah.
That's another form of disaster. All these things must be factored in. It's not a question, it's my observation.
No, but it's very interesting. You know, we've been working on this vaccines campaign, this we call the arms race. And so we've been trying to get a whole bunch of people together to see if Biden will host a vaccines summit around global vaccine inequality. Interestingly, out of the White House this afternoon, I got an email saying one of the issues about Afghanistan is it actually puts pressure on Biden to look not more internationally, but more domestically, for exactly the reason that you say. It's like, okay, let's put that aside. Let's get back to, you know, our knitting, what matters at home. So Adam, just an observation for you. I'm going to go to David. A final thought, if you have one, but B, will you answer the very difficult question of Pakistan?
Yeah, very quickly, of course, that excellent intervention shows how the whole thing is geostrategically a bit of a disaster. All sorts of things are going to flow from it. But on Pakistan, Look, there's the Pakistan mainstream politicians like I forgot the name now, the cricketer who's in charge. But yeah, those really in charge are the military, and in particular the ISI. And the ISI's game plan has for 20 years plus been to reinstall a Taliban government in Kabul, and they have won. Now, the senior military will reject that accusation. They're trying to get them under control. There's a middle-ranking lot that are cock-a-hoop at the moment, but be under no illusions, Pakistan will be the determining country in terms of how the Taliban now conduct themselves.
David, thank you. Alistair, I see you've got your hand up. I wanted to hear you. Did you have a thought? And Ro, I'm going to come to you too. Or you just unmute yourself if you would. Thanks.
I mean, first of all, to Kerry's point, I was not saying, I don't think David was, that Kosovo was comparable to Afghanistan. I was simply saying that I think you could be defined as a military success, and it was allied to long-term political success and commitment as well, which frankly I think is still there, which is why we're still arguing for, the Western Balkans to be developing the way that they are. And I think that just, I said earlier about how disappointed I was about Joe Biden, and I was kind of hoping after the reaction that there's been, that when it came to his speech last night, I actually think it was worse than what he said the other day, because even with the context of all that's happened in the last few days, it was totally America first. And I was talking the other day to the mother of a soldier who'd been killed in Afghanistan, who not surprisingly was saying, why did he go there? Why did he die? And all you can say is, well, that there was great progress made. But then to have, which there was for 20 years, and we've now put it at risk, but to have the country, the leader of the country at the head of that, not really even acknowledging the commitment that there has been, I think has just been shocking. And I think it's been done entirely for American political reasons. And the reason why the Chinese, the 4 countries that Yalda mentioned that are still there, the reason why they are rejoicing of what has happened, I think, is because dictatorship has won a big chapter in the battle between democracy and dictatorship. That is a really, really big problem for us.
Alistair, thank you. I feel you're right about that. Ro, you had a final thought.
Yes, so I think on the engagement with the Taliban and the regional actors, as Yalda talked about, the way we engage with the Taliban, unfortunately, realpolitik always trumps ethics. So there will be, inevitable for states to negotiate and talk to the Taliban, as we already do. But on the aid question, we have to make sure that any aid delivered to the Afghan people come with information to say, you are aid dependent. You suffer this misery, not because of Afghanistan's current situation, but all this situation that you're suffering from, the pain and the misery and the hunger and the problems, is because of the Taliban. These are inflicted on you by the Taliban. And now, of course, the Afghans are better connected. They know what's going on in the world, and the 40 million people still behind the dark walls of the Taliban. We have to make sure that we give them enough hope and keep the values and what they've experienced in the past 20 years alive. And I think for me, the worrying thing about the whole issue of Afghanistan is I see it as a symptom of the malaise that have the West and the liberal democratic world have been suffering from. You can see from the days after the days of Blair and Gerhard Schröder and others, we've been on the back foot. The West as a whole, as an entity, our values, our lack of willingness to defend and promote our values, we've been on the back foot, and we've let authoritarians to come forward as much as they can. And you look at and just to finish, so it's just that the West is no longer setting the agenda. We are, behaving or reacting to the agenda set by President Xi and Putin and others. So my main concern at this moment is Afghanistan will get through this. Afghans will always have to do that. But the main issue is how we move on from here. I see that the West is shrinking on in itself, which is a bigger, deeper worrying sign for the world order, rather than just us in Europe and others in Afghanistan.
Ro, thank you. Apologies for running on a few minutes late. I want to ask Shabnam and Yalda two unfair questions at the end. Shabnam, question to you. Is there anything that Boris Johnson can do to restore the trust and confidence of the Afghan people?
Continuing to keep an eye on the situation and being involved. It's something I've had personal difficulty with, particularly with MPs. And I think this is not, like so many of you mentioned, the war is not over, it's just getting started. And if you begin to just completely sideline what's happening, no more debates, no more questions, no more inquiries, it will completely break down any reliance, any friendship, any trust that the people of Afghanistan have with the UK. So you've left, there's nothing we can do about that now. But if you leave in terms of a humanitarian way, diplomatically, politically as well, then that sends a really, really poor message.
Okay, and Yalda, equally unfair. If you were the mother of a young daughter in Afghanistan today, what would you do?
You know, if I was the Taliban and I saw people falling out of the sky, hanging off a plane, I'd say, we've got a problem here. These people don't want to stay, right? I suppose the thing that I want to say is the mass exodus that we're seeing here, among those is the best and brightest of a nation, right? So the people that are coming your way include desperate people, but it also includes the best minds of the last 20 years. And so they are reluctant refugees. They wanted to stay in their communities. Many of them had foreign visas in their passports, right? In 2020, 700 intellectuals, civil society journalists were assassinated by the Taliban and ISIS. These people had visas from foreign countries to leave. They chose to stay and fight for their country. They're now being forced out, many of them kicking and screaming by the US, by the UK, saying, you've worked with us, you need to go now, right? These people are coming your way. They can contribute to this society. That's the tragedy of Afghanistan, that so much was built. These people wanted to stay in their communities and they've been forced to go. So if I was a mother of a young girl, I'd be incredibly worried and I would leave.
Okay, well, Yalda,
Can I just say one final point? Sorry, just say that I love the fact that we have 3 people from Afghanistan on a panel like this, and so many other platforms I've seen, it's always people who don't understand it, do not share the background. So just a round of applause to Tortoise for hosting 3 Afghans.
Hang on, before you say that, Shannon, let's just make sure that you give the people who don't know what they're talking about a chance. So, because I wanted to say one thing, a quick summary, because at the end of a thinking, what we try to do is try and sort of draw together what we've heard. It's not, to be fair, a kind of a consensus view, because there's not. But I just wanted to stand back, because I think that there are 3 things that really struck me, and I think they land on our to-do list, honestly, as a newsroom. The first is, I just think that I went into this really uncertain of where the future lies. And I think the thing that was really striking listening to you both in particular, and Ro too, to be fair, was just how deep that uncertainty is. You realize just how inadequate those little, who are the Taliban boxes that you read that name 4 people, and you realize actually we really don't know who the Taliban are. We don't actually clear what kind of different factions there are, and little things that I hadn't heard about, for example, people in Panjshir being cut off. You just don't know what's going on there, and you don't. So the scale of uncertainty, you talked about your family not leaving their houses. I think that's really important for us actually to internalize. How do you then keep in touch with what's happening? Because there's a lot of this story that actually has just begun now, we've got to tell. So I look at that and I think there's a real job here in terms of understanding that uncertainty. And your point, Yalda, that phrase, the 9/11 generation, that's going to really stick with me, not least because these people, so many of these people really were born after 9/11 and certainly grew up after that. So I think there's a job for us in sticking with it. I actually would just like to say thank you to David, because in the last couple of weeks, I haven't heard an idea that makes me think, oh, we could actually do that. Right? I can see the enormous problems with the idea of a UN humanitarian operation, but it does seem like a solid commitment to try and understand and deal with the problems on the ground there. Ruth Davidson's point was, let's make that the priority for conversations now. Let's make the humanitarian effort, and we can come to the broader questions of what next for the West. But I have to confess, the thing that sort of Matt talked about, and Kerry and Alistair and David in different ways, really spoke to me emotionally. And that is this sense of feeling unmoored about what we're for, really unclear. And to a certain extent, your point about feeling like we'd promised we'd do something, and now we've abandoned people, and feeling guilt and just confusion about that. And I can see exactly what Alistair's talking about, you know, a good day for dictatorships and another day of the retreat of democracy. But I think also for us, we haven't really got to grips yet with what that means. What does it mean for the UK? And I'm encouraged by David's worldview, which is there is still a place, but I'm not entirely convinced by it. I don't quite understand at this stage. And I suppose just at the end of this conversation, I'm reminded of the feelings of 2016. I remember in 2016 with Brexit and with the Trump election, there was a moment where people thought, oh, well, you know what, we've lived through 20 years of globalization, and the argument has overwhelmingly been, net, it's good. And it feels as though we've lived for 30 years with the idea of the West as bringing values and rights and the rule of law to the world. And it feels like this summer we're having a reckoning that says, well, does that work? Can that still happen? And so I just wanted to say, thank you. I feel like for us, this is one of those stories that is really what Tortoise is here for, to try and follow a story over a long, long period of time. I've seen in the chat that people are saying, can we make sure to do that? And so that's, I think, the best thing that we can do. A big thank you to everyone here, right, who's joined us. We haven't had you in the newsroom for a long time. It's really nice to see people. And a colossal thank you to David and to Shannon and to Yalda. It's been fascinating listening to you. Thank you very much, everyone.